This movie is about table styles. We're going to begin by looking at the table style options in the table style options group on the design tab. We're going to add a total row and talk a little bit about the subtotal function. And then lastly, we'll take a look at the functionality of the styles gallery. So I have some data set up in a worksheet, and it's not a table yet. And in order to get the functionality that we want to review, I need to turn this into a table. The quickest way to do that is to press Control T. Excel selects the data. My data has headers. That's true. Left click OK. And I've got a table. So we've set up a table, and of course we get the table tools, the design tab displayed. I'm going to left click and only select part of this table so you can see the changes as we make them. The first option that we have is the header row. I can deselect that box and choose to have the header row not displayed. It's displayed by default. I'm going to skip the total row for now. We're going to cover that in a second. I can choose to display banded rows or not. I can left click this first column and make the first column bold. I'm going to deselect that. I can make the last column bold. And instead of banded rows, I can choose banded columns. And since these checkboxes work independent from one another, you can select several of them at the same time. I can choose to make the first column and the last column bold and choose banded rows and banded columns and get sort of a unique look to the table. Maybe not a good look, but a unique look nonetheless. And obviously I could turn off the header row from being displayed. I've reset the default, and the next thing we're going to take a look at is adding a total row. When I select that checkbox, when I click that checkbox, I get a total row that's established for the bottom of the table. That'll of course be true no matter how long the table is. It'll always be at the bottom. And what happens when Excel inserts a total row is it inserts a subtotal function. And in the subtotal function, we have two arguments. The first argument's value is 109, and I'll explain that in a second. The second argument is Q4, which from the table's perspective, since we're in the table, is column F. If I press F2, the reference Q4 that's in brackets refers to the data that's in the table with the header Q4. The first argument, 109, and I'm going to go over here and use some IntelliSense to display this subtotal tab, is an automatic selection that's based on this list of options that determines two things. The first grouping begins with number 1 that's average, and you can see at the bottom number 101 is also average. And when I go down, count number 2, 102 is at the bottom, count A is 3, 103 is at the bottom, count A as well. The first grouping performs that mathematical function on all of the cells that's within the region. The second grouping, which adds 100 to each of the mathematical calculations in the first grouping, will end up just applying that mathematical calculation to the cells that are displayed, the visible cells. So Excel has put 109, and scrolling down, in the argument by default, and 109 will sum all the visible cells. I'm going to escape out of that, and escape out of that again. So if we want to expand our subtotal, because in this case we have a subtotal for Q4, maybe we want it for the other quarters as well, Control C, arrowing over once, enter, I can edit this to make this reference Q3 instead of Q4, and of course I can do the same thing in Q1 and Q2. I'm going to left click and select the table again, go to the design tab, and show you that you can toggle the total row on and off. When you bring it back, it comes back in the same form that you left it in. So even though the default, when you turn the total row on, is just to total the last column on the right, if you made any changes to the total row, Excel will remember those changes and display them the next time you toggle the total row on. So the last thing we want to take a look at is the Styles Gallery. And one thing that's nice about the Styles Gallery is that you get a preview so you can see what you're in for before you left click and select that option. I'm going to left click the drop down and show you that there's a lot of options here. And if you should decide that you like one of these more than another and you want to make it the default, you right click that option and then left click set as default. And if you decide also that you don't like any of these options, you can create your own by left clicking new table style, select the elements in the table, and then format each one of them independently with a border, a fill, a font style. Cancel out of that, and then you can save it as your own personal style, and at the same time set it as the default. So that was table styles. We took a look at the table styles options group on the design tab, where we have options to display the header row or not. We can show banded rows or banded columns, and we can make the first column or the last column bold, and we can choose any subset of those options. We also added a total row, and when you check that checkbox, Excel adds a total row at the bottom of the table and inserts the subtotal function that will sum all the visible cells in the last column on the right of the table. You can change that total row and add other subtotals and perform other statistical functions on those subtotals, and Excel will remember the subtotal row that you've established so that you can then toggle it on and off. Lastly, we looked at the styles gallery that presents a lot of choices as far as the graphic display of our table. And if we decide we don't like any of those, we can establish our own custom style and even set that as the default.